Welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight during Black History Month for a program on racial justice. We'll get started in a couple of minutes after giving folks a little more time to join. I'm Charlotte Gibson, president of Charlottesville Now. Now is the largest feminist grassroots activist organization in the US. Now's purpose is to eliminate discrimination and to achieve and protect the equal rights of all women and girls in all aspects of social, political, and economic life. Racial justice has been a core issue and priority for Now since its founding in 1966, along with reproductive rights, economic justice, LGBTQ+ rights, constitutional equality, and ending violence against women. If you're not already a member of Now, I urge you to join us. There is strength in numbers, and your support really matters to your local chapter. You'll find links in the chat to become a member or to donate to support Charlottesville Now. We're also always in need of volunteers. We're an all-volunteer organization. Email if you want to learn more about getting involved beyond being a member or donor. And now I want to introduce Kathy Falzer, VP of Action and Programs, to begin tonight's program. Thank you to our speakers, Lotte and Elizabeth, for being here. And thank you, Kathy, for putting this program together.
Thank you, Charlotte, so much. Our next speaker is Lotte Lieb Dula, who, as I mentioned, members of our board had the opportunity to hear speak in a reparations class last year. After discovering that she was a descendant of slaveholders, Lotte, a retired financial strategist, founded www.reparationsforslavery.com, which is a portal for white families wishing to walk the path of racial healing through making reparations. She is involved with Coming to the Table, a grassroots organization that brings together descendants of the enslaved with descendants of enslavers to work toward racial healing and justice. Lotte convenes the Denver chapter of Coming to the Table and serves on Coming to the Table's Reparations Circle Denver, which works in partnership with the Denver Black Reparations Council toward repair in Denver. Lotte has also designed a 2-year-long reparations workshop curriculum for white people who wish to commit to engaging in reparative change. Lotte, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Kathy, thank you so much. I very much appreciate being invited to speak to you tonight, and I applaud your interest in really working toward repair. And Elizabeth, it was great to hear about your organization as well. So I think each of us needs to find a way that we can personally plug in to these movements to affect repair in our communities. So thank you. I'm gonna pray to the tech gods first.
Tech is wonderful until it isn't. So
I know exactly. So we will hope for no freezes and that all the screen sharing will work. So I'm gonna get right into my presentation. And again, exactly, put your questions in the chat, and we'll this is stand by for a second, and we'll get underway. Stand by. Looks like success.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see can you see the cover of my presentation? All right, fantastic. That's so far so good. All right, well, again, welcome, and I so appreciate this opportunity to speak about the topic of reparations, which is very near and dear to my heart. So today I'm going to be speaking about the economic basis for reparations, and I'm going to use my family's history of slaveholding as the backdrop for discussing how the racial wealth gap came to be in this country. And we're going to discuss how our family narratives help hold up structures of white supremacy and what we can do to unwind them. Again, put your questions in the chat, and we'll have a quick chance after lecture to answer those questions. And I'm going to warn you, we're going to use some pretty bold language in this presentation. I'm not pussyfooting around, not holding back. So buckle your seatbelts. Now, before we begin, I always think it's a good idea to get a simple definition of reparations on the table. Reparations is the idea that redress is due to African Americans for over 400 years of systemic racism. Now, this includes, of course, 250 years of enslavement, 75 years of legal barriers to Black economic progress, including Black codes and Jim Crow laws, and another 50 plus years of struggle for basic civil and human rights. Now, it's convenient for white people to think, you know, that was so long ago. We had the civil rights movement. Why can't African Americans just get over it? Well, the reason is simple. Slavery didn't end. It merely evolved into a complex system that nearly always guarantees that white people will have better opportunities for success than Black people. Now, as a descendant of people who created and benefited from the institution of slavery, I developed this map so that I could begin to study how racism affects my daily life in each of the areas listed to the left, and then find ways I could unwind this harm. Now, of course, we don't have time to review all these areas today, but I call these the vectors of economic racism. And you'll find more information about these topics on the reparationsforslavery.com portal. Now, I'm sure you're aware of some of the effects of systemic racism that you see every day in your own communities. And of course, these have been born of our history of enslavement. And of course, these phenomena are not unique to the US, nor is the movement for reparations itself. In fact, this movement is active around the world. Ex-colonial powers across Europe, including Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, as well as Brazil and the US, are being called out for their roles in founding and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which transported as many as 13 million Africans over 400 years to the Americas and the Caribbean. 4 million were brought to our shores from 1619 to the early 1800s in a slave trading triangle that included Africa, America, Europe, and the West Indies. Now, there was a very high mortality rate. At least 15% of enslaved Africans did not survive the voyage. Now, this does not count those that died while being forcibly marched to their embarkation points or died in captivity here. We'll pause for a moment to read this excerpt from a ship's captain to an investor. Sir, I received bills of lading for 5 Negroes and 1 hogshead of rum. 1 Negro woman, marked Y on the left breast, died in about 3 weeks after her arrival. In spite of medical aid, which I procured, all the rest died at sea. I'm sorry for your loss. It may have resulted from deficient clothing so early in the spring. So clearly, this is a letter from a captain to the investor. And likely the captain made an insurance claim on this loss. After all, the insurance industry was born of the slave trade. Now, in 2016, a United Nations panel ruled that reparations is due to descendants of enslaved people around the world. The UN defines 5 areas of repair: restitution, which includes restoration of liberty and human rights and the return of property; compensation for damages, including physical harm, as well as lost opportunities and earnings; rehabilitation from the health and psychological effects of enslavement and institutional racism; satisfaction, or the cessation of human rights violations and abuses; establishment of truth-seeking commissions; public apologies; and the establishment of sites to commemorate the history of enslavement; and finally, guarantees of non-repetition, the reforms needed to ensure the prevention of future abuse. Now, in the US, there are 2 major paths toward repair. Most African-American reparations groups are pushing for a national program of reparations. In fact, the official definition of reparations is nothing short of full remuneration to descendants of enslaved Africans. This includes goals for passage of a reparations bill, H.R. 40, created to look at economic redress. Now, this bill has been introduced to the legislature for the last, I think, 33 years now, but it's remained sidelined. This year, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has reintroduced it, and it's currently gaining support, more support than ever. It has over 200 co-sponsors or yes votes in the House And the companion Senate Bill SR S40, I think, has 22. So this is a controversial issue, but it's gaining support. Now, the other path to repair involves family and community reparations, which we refer to as personal partial reparations. Now, these are not substitutes for a federal program of repair, but they do represent steps that we can take to begin to unwind the personal harm white families have perpetrated against Black families. These are the first steps we can take to begin to heal the wounds of the past. Since my work is focused on bringing white people to the table, I've identified 4 principles which can guide us along the path of repair. First, we need to be fearless in facing both our country's true history as well as our family's role within it. Next, in view of this history, we need to be willing to examine and reimagine our origin stories, or the narratives we tell about our families and communities, especially in regard to race and the generation of wealth. Next, we need to commit to engage with others across the racial divide in acts that will unwind harm and bring about repair. And yes, finally, yep, we've got to use our resources, our agency, our time, and our money to invest in repair. Now, is this easy work? No, it's pretty difficult work. But these are the beginning steps of what repair looks like. And today we're going to be focusing on learning some mechanisms necessary to bring white families into the reparations movement, into the current of repair. To start off this discussion, I'd like to show you how my family narrative is changing as I face my family's history and commit to repair. As you know, my name is Lotte Lieb Dula, and I'm a retired financial strategist. I host a portal called reparationsforslavery.com. And I don't know about you, but I grew up hearing about my ancestors in the most glowing terms possible. I learned that I was a proud descendant of Colorado pioneers, that I was a descendant of true patriots, the founders of our country, as well as immigrants who came here with nothing but the shirts on their backs in search of the American dream. Another narrative I grew up with expressed my family's very traditional values. I grew up believing that America was a meritocracy and that the playing field was level, both principles of fiscal conservatism. Now, I'm sure some of you received the same messages growing up, right? Especially this one. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. My journey began in 2015 when my mother, Peggy, died. I began the process of going through 30 boxes of family ephemera. Oh, what fun. Each box was labeled precious, family treasure, don't throw away. I had nightmares of being buried alive in these boxes, I can tell you. But I was excited to learn more about my ancestors, who my mother had described so glowingly. One of the first boxes I opened contained my grandmother, Jeanette Welch's keepsakes. I found all sorts of cool trinkets. For instance, I was delighted to find photos of my grandmother dressed in costume as Robin Hood. And what fun to page through her 1907 Smith College yearbook and to see her suited up in a Victorian basketball uniform. I found that she had belonged to all sorts of quaint social clubs. And it was thrilling to realize that these early experiences formed my grandmother's lifelong passion for the arts, passions so many in my family share. But I also made a discovery that took my breath away. My grandmother had been a member of the KKK Social Club, as well as the Orangemen, 2 groups that I discovered were steeped in both hate and racism. Now, it might have been tempting to dismiss these pages as some lightweight sorority fluff, but as I considered my family's background, my initial joy turned to a deep sense of unease. With some trepidation, I started going through my grandfather, William Paxton Carey's things. He'd been a beloved judge, famous for his fairness. Surely there'd be nothing in Judge Carey's belongings to give me pause about my heritage. I hoped anyway. I was amazed to find some mid-19th century daguerreotype photos, and with them a very nondescript looking little black book. I opened it, and I was thrilled to discover that the book belonged to my grandfather's grandfather, William Hayes Paxton. As I paged through the book, I noticed the perfect penmanship and the neat rows of figures. You know, I had often wondered, how does a finance person get born into a cultural arts family? I immediately felt a sense of kinship with my second great-grandfather as I paged through his business ledger. Ah, so this is where I get my business sense from. But as I turned the pages, it became clear that I was looking at inventory records for a Mississippi cotton plantation. I stopped cold as I read the inscription on pages 27 through 30. Loss of slaves by war. Each line had a name, age, and value. My heart froze. I was the descendant of slaveholders. And like so many descendants, I had no prior knowledge of my family's true history in the South. That history had been conveniently erased, much like the history of slavery has been erased from our textbooks. But here it was, evidence that some of my ancestors had become millionaires in the Mississippi Delta, the majority of their wealth coming not just from their land grants, but from the value of human chattel. What's become clear to me is this: as enslaved Africans who are effectively building this country, my white ancestors were not only amassing wealth and social advantage, they were building the legal and economic structures that have prevented Black people from amassing wealth themselves. Now, in grade school, we all learned that we the people form the basis of our government. But as I continued my research, it was becoming apparent that we the people clearly meant we the white people. Figure out how my family fit into this puzzle. So I did a bit of research, and here's what I found. It all started with Elisha Paxton, my third great-grandfather. He established a plantation near Lexington, Virginia, beginning around 1815. From the late 1820s on, Elisha sent 6 sons to college, likely with proceeds amassed from plantation operations. Most of them attended Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Yep, that Lee. At least 4 sons earned law degrees. In the early 1830s, several of Elisha's sons, including my second great-grandfather, moved to the Mississippi Delta near Vicksburg. There they set up a law practice with their uncle and later multiple cotton plantations, the same ones that were detailed in that ledger. This uncle, Alexander McNutt, became governor of Mississippi in 1837. He was a colleague of Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy. Here are 19th century maps of those plantations on Deer Creek near present-day Arcola, Mississippi. Now, most of these plantations eventually went bust, and my second great-grandfather, William, lost his shirt. But it didn't matter because he could still rely on his law practice to earn a living. Now let's look at one of the adjoining parcels. Bolin Lucas and Jim Collier had both worked the Paxton Plantations. Bolin Lucas was an enslaved man and had been the Paxton's trusted slave driver, while Jim Collier was a white overseer. After emancipation, they went into business together, bought a nearby parcel, and began farming. Jim Collier soon died. Upon his death, his estranged wife sued for possession of the land. Since Bolin Lucas was illiterate, Jim Collier's wife was able to deceive him and seize the land. Let's review the economic progress of white families, including my family, versus the people they enslaved, shall we? My family receives many, many land grants in Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Colorado, at least. Enslaved people can't own land before 1865, of course. Even from 1866 on, when they become eligible to apply for land grants under the Homestead Act, less than 2% of land grants are awarded to freed slaves. My family enslaves Africans to work on their plantations, becoming wealthy since they don't have to pay wages. Enslaved people are sometimes permitted to work side jobs, but as a whole, they're unable to amass wealth. Even after emancipation, Black codes and Jim Crow laws restrict what they can do, how much money they can earn, and how far they can travel. My family uses its wealth to pay for future generations' private education. Emancipated Africans are mostly illiterate since it's been illegal since 1829 for enslaved people to learn to read or write. After emancipation, they are barred from attending white schools, so with few resources, they must build their own. Now, despite extreme hardship, as we all know, African-American families show great resilience. Some manage to amass savings, which they deposit into the Freedman Savings Bank when it's established in 1865. Unfortunately, in 1873, Congress, under controversial circumstances, mismanages the funds and it goes bust, losing 70,000 families' combined lifetime savings of $3 million, the equivalent of $47 million today. This setback has been considered the economic equivalent of extending slavery for another 10 years. My family has another advantage. When it comes to the transfer of wealth, our legal training gives us the ability to draft wills so that our heirs won't have to go through probate. Here's my second great-grandfather's will, including the real estate, dwelling houses, lots, and yes, those cotton lands. African Americans, on the other hand, have little access to legal services, nor do they trust white lawyers. Many are still illiterate and die without wills, and their property becomes heirs' property, a situation in which all living relatives inherit the property together, but individuals retain the rights to sell it without informing the other heirs. Since 1910, as much as 90% of Black-owned land has been lost due to legal treachery, as white developers and even local, state, and federal agencies dupe individual heirs or find legal loopholes to grab valuable heirs' property. As we head into the 20th century, does the playing field seem level to you? All right, next, let's look at the effects of programs that catapulted many white families, including my parents, into the middle class. 1933's Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to help white farmers by cutting farm production, and thus forcing up food prices. However, less production meant less work for thousands of poor Black sharecroppers who lost their rented land and their livelihoods. The Social Security net was created in 1935 in response to the Great Depression, but by design, many Black workers are not covered, including farm and domestic workers. Nearly 40% of Black people in the South are excluded. The establishment of the FHA in 1935 and Fannie Mae in 1938 gave white families the ability to finance and insure new homes, but Black families are effectively blocked from these programs due to race-related property covenants. Then there's the GI Bill. After World War II, many white families used proceeds from the GI Bill to get an education, start a business, or purchase a home. Now, we know that Black veterans are blocked outright from receiving home or business loans, but the same thing happens with the education benefit. Only 20% of Black veterans that apply are accepted into these programs. Again, despite all of these economic roadblocks, some Black families are able to establish financially independent enclaves and neighborhoods. For instance, Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black Wall Street was the largest and wealthiest Black community in the US, with its own banks, school system, public transportation, you name it. Much of this wealth was created based on lands granted by the 5 civilized tribes to Africans they had enslaved. The land was granted at emancipation. When oil was discovered on these lands, many African Americans, therefore, became wealthy. Yeah, Freedman prospered when given access to the same opportunities my white ancestors enjoyed. However, wherever there is Black excellence and prosperity, white people attempt to destroy it. In 1921, a white woman accused a Black teenager of touching her inappropriately, and this resulted in the firebombing of the Greenwood neighborhood in 1921 by the federal government. The 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre was last summer, and many gathered there to call for reparations. Now, this example is certainly extreme, but it's not unique. Wherever Black prosperity has blossomed, there has been hell to pay, much of it disguised in the name of progress for generations. The result, by the 1950s, many white families have joined the middle class, while most Black families are held back. Today, a Black family's median net worth is just 1/10 that of a white family. And we're beginning to see why. Let's look at these factors again. How many of us know the history of economic racism? How many of us have bought the Bootstrap Argument without an understanding of our own role in holding back Black economic development? Derek Hamilton and Trevon Logan are two economists that have aptly summarized the genesis of white wealth. It was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy and to some extent literal government giveaways that provided whites the finance, education, land, and infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. Or as Martin Luther King Jr. puts it, it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. All right, we've taken apart the bootstrap argument that's been used against Black people for their lack of economic progress. We've also rightly pinned the blame on owning class people like my enslaved ancestors. What about immigrants, though? How do my immigrant ancestors fit into this puzzle? Let's take another look at my family tree, this time on my father's side. My father's great-grandfather, Joseph Lieb, emigrated from Germany in the 1850s with his wife, Anna Maria Zellergrotz. They arrived in New York, where he worked for 5 years as a laborer, eventually saving enough money to move to Hebron, Wisconsin, where he established a farm. Now, my father grew up hearing rumors that the Liebs had shortened their name when they arrived in this country, and that they may even have been Jewish. What binds Joseph and Anna Maria with other Northern European immigrants is how they began the assimilation process, or what some racial justice advocates are now calling the process of becoming white. Through this process, Irish, Polish, German, Italian, and other immigrants gradually shed their cultural identities to fit in and work toward achieving the American dream. Many anglicized their names to avoid prejudice, and as was the case in my family, marry into long-established patrician families. What common traits enable them to do this? Being light-skinned. But how do Jewish immigrants fit into this puzzle? Well, this issue is, as you might imagine, quite complex. On the one hand, Jewish people and African Americans are both known for their resilience and accomplishments despite intense and unrelenting oppression. On the other hand, Jewish people who flee persecution in Europe and gradually ascend to the middle class in America also share some of the benefits many ascribe to whiteness, but not all identify themselves as white. British author Thomas Harding has had a recent experience that perfectly illustrates this paradox. His Jewish ancestors fled Germany, leaving their home to escape Nazi persecution. A few years ago, Thomas was researching his heritage and discovered that the house his family had left near Berlin was still standing. Thomas met with the German family who now lived there. They acknowledged the crime and gave Thomas back his family's historic home. And in fact, Thomas received reparations, much like we're discussing today. Now, this is possible because of the German admission of guilt in the Holocaust, an admission the US has not made with respect to the crime of 250 years of slavery. More recently, Thomas was researching another line of heritage. In the early 1800s, his family had started one of the largest catering companies in the world, which also happened to sell tea and tobacco. He discovered that much of his family's wealth had come from importing tobacco and other crops grown on Virginia plantations by enslaved Africans. Remarkably, though Thomas was owed reparations on one side of his family, he realized that he himself owed reparations on the other side. Now, ultimately, the Jewish connection to slavery is minuscule. The Christian faith plays a much larger role in this country's history of enslavement. Christians, many fleeing religious persecution in England and elsewhere, migrate to our shores, beginning the process of colonization. Their ranks include both Catholics and Protestants, and there are many offshoots. Another paradox soon emerges. While firmly standing for principles of religious and economic freedom, many of these divergent religious movements also support the enslavement of Africans. My 10th great-grandfather, for instance, George Calvert, establishes the province of Maryland in 1632 as a safe haven for Catholics fleeing religious persecution in England. However, my ancestors also seek to amass wealth and soon see the economic advantages of planting tobacco. By 1660, they passed laws making slavery legal in Maryland, adding a new concept, unlike in other areas at the time, slaves in Maryland will be considered slaves for life. Tobacco plantations and the business of the slave trade soon become the economic engine of the region. What act sets the stage, giving my 10th great-grandfather the divine right to do these things? In 1452, the Catholic Church gives Portugal and Spain full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate unbelievers, wherever they may be, and reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. 40 years later, another papal bull is issued, the Doctrine of Discovery, in 1493. These two acts set the stage for the church to bring terror and subjugation to millions of people around the world for hundreds of years to come. Well, fantastic, right? All right, so we've learned that our nation's history may be a bit more complicated than we thought. And we learned that white families, regardless of when we arrived, likely have some involvement, either directly or indirectly, with the institution of slavery. Even our faith communities have participated in a major way. Now, where do we go with this information? What do we do? A really powerful place to start is uncovering and transforming our origin stories. This is one of the simplest yet most compelling things white families can do as we begin down the path of repair. Much of our national narrative centers around the white myth of being self-made and the supposed superiority of white people to people of other races. Black trauma can be traced to laws enacted to provide economic advantages to white people, like my family, and to the selected erasure of this history. In taking apart and rebuilding our own family, community, and institutional narratives, we begin to unravel the myth of white supremacy and thus begin to change our national narrative from the ground up. Here's an example of an evolving family narrative that has relevance to events in Washington, D.C. Early last year. This is my great-grandfather, G.W. Carey. I grew up hearing about him in the highest terms possible. Last winter, I was feeling distressed about the events of January 6th and the general state of the Union, and I thought I would look to my ancestors for comfort. While researching online, I was thrilled to find an obituary I had never seen before. But once again, I was disturbed by what I discovered. As it turned out, he had been a member of the White League, a group I had never even heard of. And the obituary made an oblique reference to a fight that occurred on the 14th of September. On September 14th, 1874, my great-grandfather participated in a coup to overthrow the Reconstruction-era government in New Orleans. 1,500 members of the White League, a militia of Confederate veterans opposed to the civil rights goals of Reconstruction, attacked New Orleans and overthrew the Louisiana government. Ousted were pro-Reconstruction politician William Pitt Kellogg, governor of Louisiana, and Lieutenant Governor Cesar Carpenter Antoine, an African-American man. They'd have been elected largely on the strength of their support among African-American voters. The insurgents held the State House, Armory, and downtown for 3 days, finally retreating just before the arrival of federal troops who restored the elected government. No insurgents were charged in the action, though hundreds of people supporting the Reconstruction-era government were killed. Sound vaguely familiar? Well, I'm sorry to say, the story my family has told about my great-grandfather for over 100 years, it's fiction. From my vantage point today, my grandfather, I just can't see him as a hero. He helped to uphold the legacy of slavery his entire life. In order for me to truly commit to the repair this country so desperately needs, in order for me to deeply understand and connect with my Black peers' origin stories, I need to both face our country's true history and learn to tell the truth about my own. I need to acknowledge that my ancestors are holding a smoking gun while I've inherited the keys to the kingdom. Therefore, it's up to me to engage in repair. I'll say it again because it's worth repeating. Until white people confront the truth and begin to change our origin stories to match the narratives Black families have been telling for 400 years, until we begin the truth-telling process, this nation cannot heal from its wounds. Further, all white families, regardless of economic class or immigrant background, need to look at our narratives. Once we've engaged in this truth-telling process, we've got to find a way to engage spiritually and to atone for these harms. Ultimately, despite all of our differences, what knits us together is our pursuit of the American dream. However, buying into the American dream is no different than buying into a business. The balance sheet contains both assets and liabilities. As someone who may have inherited my financial skills from a slaveholding ancestor, I can tell you the liability for engaging in 400 years of systemic racism has now come due. Take a little breath there. I just want to end by saying our goal in doing this work is nothing less than transformation of our society and the creation of the equitable future so many of us long for. This is the path of co-liberation. Making reparations, we begin the process of healing ourselves, of making our communities whole. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you, Lotte, so much for a very good lesson laying out the argument for reparations and how we all need to look at our own stories to so that everybody else will face it as well, as more and more people do so, hopefully.
Absolutely. I think we have time for a few questions anyway. If anybody has any questions, is there anything in the chat?
I'm not sure. Virginia.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but if I have a question myself, and we'll take a look at the other questions as they come in. I'd like to ask you, in the light of what you're saying, ironically, right now, we're going through this, in my opinion, walking backwards thing of people combating this idea of teaching CRT, critical race theory, in the schools, wanting to take books out of school libraries and so on. And I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's pretty deplorable. We're as a Black history professor that I work with, Tammy Rowan, who Judith knows well, says we're watching, just as we did with Reconstruction starting in 1877. We saw many of much of the progress that had been made began to be unwound. And so that's the same thing that's happening now. It just seems very, very parallel. So I think we have to do the same thing that people on in the opposite corner are doing, which is really get better control over the school boards. So that means getting to work. What I'm doing personally is, I've created the website, and we've created a 2-year curriculum to begin to make up for the fact that everything we know is wrong. I mean, I don't even remember, I grew up in California. There might've been one paragraph about slavery in those textbooks. I didn't know a thing. And so I'm still drinking from a fire hydrant, realizing that basically everything that I studied was untrue. So, we've got a battle, and this is personal for me. What I like to say is you need to learn your family's history and see how it connects up with this country's history, and make it specific. My mother belonged to United Daughters of the Confederacy. My mother appeared not to be a racist. I never thought of her as one, but she bought the line that, oh, this is a cultural organization. There's nothing racist about it. Well, what do? They They put up all those monuments, and they're the ones behind many of our textbooks that reframe the lost cause narrative. So therefore, that's a bit of harm that I need to unwind. There's some karma there. And so I put together, if you look at reparationsforslavery.com, there's a state by state guide to institutional race, the history of institutional racism. There is a very in-depth 24-session guide so you can see exactly how the racial wealth gap came to be, which I've sort of capsulized in this lecture. But, in our classes, for instance, I have people, all right, did your family get land grants? That's free land. There's an asset that you got that was free that Black people couldn't get. That gives us an advantage. How does land figure in your history? Most people have never really thought about that. But once you start looking, wow, you can actually find your ancestors and find that they have received land grants, and you can begin to see the advantages we have. So you've got to make it personal.
So one of the questions now, Lotte, is where do you suggest that an individual should start in this process?
I would say the best place to start, certainly I'll pitch my website. Start learning your history off the site. It's really, really got a lot. It might take you a full year to do a deep dive of everything. And then also get into genealogy. We teach a class, Brianna Cuffey and I, she's my partner on the site. She's a young African-American woman. We have a reparative relationship across race, class, age. She's like half my age, and geography. She's in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm in Denver. We've begun to teach a class called reparative genealogy. Genealogy has been mostly for elderly white ladies who want to prove their Mayflower lineage, right? Isn't that that was true of my ancestors, man. They were really, in fact, one of my great grandmother was the head genealogist for the Mayflower Society. Little karma there. So Brie and I'm unwinding that by teaching reparative genealogy, which is learning this history. And then if you have an enslavement background in your family, you need to get those records and repatriate those. You need to find the records, because that's somebody else's family is encapsulated in the records. Like that little black book. I've got 44 souls trapped in that book who are not connected up to their family. It may be the only record of their names. So I've been working with an African-American genealogist trying to trace who are these people. And we think we found some descendants who can now say, I found one member of my family from that era. So learn your family history, learn the history of your region, wherever your family's from, and then find out what historic acts of history your family may have been involved with. And then just start with that, what's personal. I've got on the site how to design a family plan of repair, how to design a faith community plan of repair. So there are plenty of things anybody can do going on the site. They're just a whole toolbox full of possibilities. We'll say that.
Right. One of the questions also is, how have you personally made reparations?
Yeah, lots and lots of ways. When I first made the discovery, I was in a complete white bubble. I had no friends who were not white, no coworkers who were not white, all white neighborhood. That was my whole life. I was at zero. And I thought, wow, I'm in a white bubble. What do I do? So I thought, well, I could put together a scholarship for the United Negro College Fund. So I did that, and I thought, well, what kind of scholarship should it be? I thought, well, let's look at how my family made its money. So they were all attorneys, doctors, and many of them were in government. They were government officials. So I put together a scholarship for law, medicine, or political science. And so a young woman received the scholarship, and she's now an anesthesiologist in New York. And I'm in touch with her, and we have a reparative relationship. So I helped her move for her residency and have an apartment there. With Brianna, I don't think she minds saying it. I'm helping her. When I met her at a coming to the table conference, she thought I was really pretty arrogant with my ideas. And so she just came up and just slapped me upside the head. And I thought, of course, I'm kind of smart that, oh, you're a good partner. So within just literally hours, I had agreed to pay off her college debt. And so I'm working to pay off her college debt and help her buy her a house. And you remember that net worth chart. I told her that she's 28 now, and we've been working together 4 years. And I told her, by the time you're 40, I want you to have the typical net worth a white 40-year-old would have. That's what we're going to do. And so part of it is also, it's not just financial. Like I'm giving her tons of advice on purchasing real estate. Anything that I know, I consider my capital that needs to be shared. So I do a lot of mentoring with people. Like I've got a really good PowerPoint. Did you like my PowerPoint? It's a nice design. Looks good. So a lot of people say that's a nice looking PowerPoint. And so I say, look, African-American colleagues, if you like my designer, give me your PowerPoint and I'll pay to have my designer redo it for you. So you've got a really top-notch presentation for whatever you're doing. So I've done that a number of times so that people who are just starting out and wanting to get consulting, starting their consulting world will look more professional. My father was a film, he was a cinematographer for many years. And so a friend of mine who was a poet wanted a film made of her reciting one of her amazing works. And we made a film together. So that reverses some of the harm that exists in Hollywood. Because my family was deeply involved in Hollywood. So I make it really, really personal. And whenever I find an opportunity, I just jump in there. And yeah, it's really messy work. It's messy work. I mean, really messy work. People can get offended. It's dicey. And this is how you work across the racial divide. I mean, I've done some kind of dicey things, kind of like plenty of times, like for instance, when you bring in a Black speaker, you've got to pay them. Not paying people is not okay. So occasionally I'll be asked to bring in a speaker with me, bring in, and nobody wants to pay. And I'll tell people, well, I'm paying her. You have to, so you got to rethink things like that. So that's a very short list of some of the reparative work I've done.
That was good. That was a good list. Someone is asking, could you tell just a little bit about the 2-year curriculum you have made up, sort of a class on this?
Yeah, maybe Judith could answer that because she's attended most of the year. I'll start it off and maybe Judith can comment about what she thinks about it. Yeah, I could actually, if I share my screen, I can actually show you better than tell you. Would you mind? Now it's 6:28. Do we need to stop and do something different for a minute, or no, we're good? All right, let me, the pause that refreshes, let me find my website. It'll take me a minute to find it and then I'll show you. You'll hear me clicking around in here. Sorry about that. This website is a little bit slow these days. There's too much stuff on there. All right, hang on a sec here. Okay. All right, you should be able to see my website there. If you go on there, under daylighting history, you can see there are just a ton of resources here. So this is one that you could start. You could start tonight. You can stay up all night long. This is this is a really interesting little podcast, very short podcast about somebody talking about why it's so important to understand our history, which has mostly been erased. Then if you go by region, you can look by region and look at the history of slavery in each state. And these are just simple stuff. I've just done the work for you. You can go to Wikipedia, you can go to, there are personal narratives of people who were enslaved. You can find out more about Black codes and Jim Crow laws in the area. Each state has a timeline. There are articles, books, podcasts, film and video. If it's in the South or where there are plantations, those are listed. And then you can, places where you can start doing genealogical research. We're developing a list of questions for research and reflection. So that's, this is true for all the different states.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's only one of the tools. So the 2-year curriculum, this is year 1. It's called The Racial Wealth Gap, Understanding the Economic Basis for Repair, which is the title of my presentation. And it's the first session is that presentation and exercises that get people rewriting their narratives. So each one, you go through slavery. So it has to be related to the racial wealth gap. I mentioned the land patents, land grants. So each one you hear about what were the Homestead Acts, et cetera. Then you can research each topic the same way: articles, books, videos, and then there are questions that you would answer for yourself. You go through Reconstruction, convict leasing, sharecropping. We talked briefly about the collapse of the Freedman's Bank, the Tulsa Massacre, New Deal. So you've heard a little bit in my presentation about each of these topics, but there's just a ton to look through. Plus, just the fact that African-American income suppression was a thing. You can read all about all the different ways that happened, all the different ways, vectors for suppression. All kinds of studies about the racial wealth gap. So that's one. So that's a full 24 sessions to do that. Then this year, in fact, I'll let Judith talk about it. This year we're looking at what are the modern effects. So we've studied all that history. Now we want to look at each area: land, housing, food systems, civil rights, all of these topics. How do these show up today? And what does freedom look like? So that's what we're doing right now. We've started a 12 session one. We've got, and I'll just show one more, but there's a ton of things you can do on here. So this is Brianna, my partner. And this is us. This is our beta version of our new curriculum on reparative genealogy. We do a 5-part series on that, teaching people how to do it. My mouse isn't working. Let me see if I can, okay. And so you can learn everything you need to know about how to engage in reparative genealogy. I've written the white part, Bree's written the black part. So Judith, what do you think?
Well, the last year in 2021, taking the course every other week was real grounding, and it really expanded so much more than I even thought I knew. Tammy Roan, that Lottie mentioned, did a lot of the training and a lot of the history. Also want to mention too, Kathy Spar on this call was also part of that course. She took the course with us. And so this year we're jumping in. We've only had one session this year, but we'll be looking more deeply into doing the reparations and taking action. Correct, Lottie?
Yeah, that's right. We're going to function as a sort of more of a dating service this year, trying to get everybody plugged into the reparations sphere and working on a project together. So we'll be taking action every session to work on some sort of project. So yeah. We're over time. Any other questions or do we?
I have one other question. When I was in a discussion about this with a Black person, the Black person said, "Oh, we had affirmative action, we had Head Start, public housing, all that stuff, and none of it ever helped. So I'm not really in favor of reparations. What do you say to that?
I say there are many different views. The Black community is not united for sure on, I think it's evenly split reparations, no reparations, and people even advocating for reparations have different views as to what that looks like. I say, I'm looking at my family history and I'm looking at the racial wealth gap, and I'm saying reparations are owed. Nobody could dissuade me from that fact. And the reason nothing has ever worked is because we've erased our history. I mean, if you look at Germany made, I wouldn't call it reparations capital R, but some remuneration for the Holocaust. And part of what they did was they changed how they taught history in the schools. They had a very different way than we have been doing with our textbooks. And without proper teaching of history, there just can't be repair, because you have people like me running around before 4 years ago, before I had my turning point, thinking I was a hardcore fiscal conservative. It's like, you get what you put in, you know, everybody's equal. I mean, literally, that's exactly how I thought. And I was kind of a jerk and a bit of a racist. And now I've got a pile of crows on my desk and I just eat them all day long.
Lotte, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions.
Okay. Well,
I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
Thanks, Virginia. Thank you, Lotte. That was great. And I really appreciate your sharing the website with us too, because I have been on it, but I didn't know how much was really there clicking on all of those tabs. So I think that's really wonderful. Thank you very much for being here tonight. So the official meeting is over now. If anybody wants to stay and chat, and sometimes we keep the conversation going for a little bit. So Charlotte?
Lotte, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I am really inspired by your work. You did all that in 4 years? Wow. You must be doing this all day, every day.
Yeah, I work 6-7 days a week because that's what's for dinner. This is what needs to be done, and what the heck. So yeah, and I do, you know, I do a workshop version of this lecture. Some of you have seen it probably a bunch of times, but so you maybe take a nap next time. But I do a workshop and have white people reimagine their family stories. So that's just as important as learning your history, is to sort of to do that. So if anybody were interested in the future, that's something that we offer. Bree and I also offer a course in reparative genealogy. So.
And I see that that's in the chat. That's going to be offered at the Senior Center here in Charlottesville on March 17th. That sounds great. We can check that out as well. Well, I really appreciate you being here and taking very valuable time away from your research to share with us today. You're doing remarkable work. And we need more of you doing this work.